My Mother, The Person and the Patient is an original podcast written and hosted by me, Fatuma Kuso. This podcast is about my mother, Timira Abdussamid Mohammed, Ayaya we call her, and that's the Somali word for grandmother, and her great-grandchildren call her Ayaya too, and that is their way of saying great-grandmother. It's very interesting to see how the plans we set up for ourselves for 6 months down the road, 4 months down the road, 2 weeks down the road, and how those plans could change drastically to something totally different. So for me, by the time we finished fasting for Ramadan, I had all these plans that when the school year ended, I would create journals, worksheets to go along with my mother living with Alzheimer's, learning pieces that I was going to take from the episodes to create, to share with people in the same position I am in. I was going to stay with my mother, take care of her, and work on all these projects that I had. There are manuscripts that I finished that needed editing and reviewing and sending out. I was going to have a plan laid out for new project that I wanted to work on. So all those things were in the pipeline for me. I even applied to teach summer course online so I could earn a little bit of money and stay home and take care of my mother. All those were in the plans. And the only thing I was worried about was my mother's situation turning for the worse, for her getting sick. And that I planned for. What am I going to do if my mother was sick? What would happen if this happened? What would happen? I had all the contingencies I could think about for dealing with my mother's Alzheimer's, because that's the only thing I could see in being a roadblock. So in my mind, I prepared myself for my mother's Alzheimer's throwing another roadblock in my way and hindering my ability to do what I needed to do. But that's not what happened at the end. So what happened at the end was my daughter's situation, which I couldn't even finish the school year because my daughter went missing on May 26th, as you know, and we had to deal with everything that came with it. Interestingly enough, my mother's Alzheimer's did nothing to cause problems for him. In fact, my mother seemed to have reached at a level where she is stable. She was admitted to hospice December of 22, but she is so stable now. She'd been discharged from hospice and sent back to the regular care practitioners. Even through CCAC, when my mother was admitted to hospice, she was also assigned to a complex care case coordinator, which is a different type of case coordinator to help out with the end of life care and all the medication and things that you might need at that stage. So now the regular case coordinator called me last week and said, okay, I got your mother's file back. We need to meet and go over what the needs are. So as you can see, I had planned challenges coming from Alzheimer's to me to stop me from all the projects that I was planning on doing. But that's not what happened. The challenge came from my daughter's situation, who's technically speaking should not have been an issue for me. So you see how things we plan for and things that come are totally different. In this process, I am learning to accept what is rather than what should have been. I'm accepting that it wasn't my mother's Alzheimer's that caused me the greatest grief, but the loss of my daughter, the unexpected tragedy that is losing my daughter. So I'm accepting the power beyond me that says, this is not where your challenge is this time. This is where your challenge is. And living with that That doesn't make it any easier to grieve. That doesn't make it any less painful of what I'm experiencing. But it showed me human limitations that I have in dealing with challenges that life presents in my way. And that has made all the difference. When you listen to how we arrived at my mother's diagnosis and what followed, it's so easy to see her just as the patient, to see her as nothing more than the disease that reduced her to shell of her old self. But I want also to tell you about my mother, the person, the fierce woman that told her stories unapologetically, celebrating the beautiful parts and harsh realities equally. I want to share with you the stories she told us about her life as a girl growing up in a small village, the tales that marked her adulthood. I want to share with you all her losses and the ultimate winnings. The following chapter is one of those stories, reconstructed from my childhood memory. As the ceremony for the baby drew near, Timiro's husband grew excited. He struggled to choose a person to take Ruqiyya out of the house for the first time. This is important, he said, as if Timiro didn't know the custom of coming out ceremony that said the child takes after the first person that brings them out of the house. We should choose it wisely, he said. Who do you think we should ask? He repeated that question to Timiro many times. You know them better than I do. She opted for the best answer. I think you should choose. He went back and forth from this person to that person and back again. Timiro could tell no one seemed good enough for his daughter. They're all good people. You can't go wrong no matter who you choose. With so much hesitation, Timiro was overjoyed when he finally settled for Dahaba. That out of the way, the planning for the celebration began at the end of the 3rd week from the birth. Her stepmother and 2 women from the Habs group gathered by the fire to work on the white bamboo fabric outfit for the Haba and the baby. Timiro wasn't allowed to join them outside, so her stepmother brought the dresses to her so she could inspect the progress. What do you think? Faduma asked. Timiro was awe-struck by the magnificent designs the woman drew. Following the same pattern for the baby and the Habo, they knitted pink, yellow, beige, purple, blue, and red flower petals from the hem of the dress. They worked their way up until they covered the entire back and front of the Haba's dress and Ruqiyya's outfit. The happiness brought by all the preparation to welcome her daughter into the world grew tenfold when her father came with Farah and the twins the morning of the event. Abu, you're here! That feeling of being her father's child returned to her. And miss all this? Her father pointed at over a dozen women cooking. Each hovered over enormous pots of rice, meat, and beans that bubbled over large outdoor cooking fires. Her father and Farah joined the men, including her husband, who sat in a circle in the sitting room. They read surahs from the Quran, taking turns. They continued to recite until the sound of the prayer call from the city masjid for Duhur, the midday prayer, reached their ears. As soon as they finished praying, the men, Muhammad in the lead, stepped outside the house. They stood in 2 lines, one on either side of the door. Timiro, dressed in a yellow dira and a white slip and a white scarf, stood up from her chair as soon as the Haba walked in and handed her the baby wrapped in the white flowery dress designed for her. Allahu Akbar, the Haba said as she took the baby. Just a few steps behind the Habo and the baby, and next her stepmother, Timiro emerged out of the room for the first time in 6 weeks. The Habib stopped and lifted the white veil that covered the baby. Allahu Akbar, she said again. Everyone, including Timiro, repeated after her, God is great. The Habib walked on the path, the men on either side of her. As she passed, each man placed a hand over the baby's head and recited a prayer. May you be an abundant blessing to your parents, it began, and continued, until the Haba, Ruqayya still in her arms, reached the middle of the courtyard. The Haba lifted the baby high again. Allahu Akbar, she said, leading the other to exalt Allah. Meet Ruqayya Muhammad Kuso, and she announced the baby aloud. The woman looked up from the cooking fires and erupted into the loudest ululations Timira had ever heard. Allahu Akbar, they said in unison. Family members, friends, and people from the neighborhood lined up to greet the baby. Each person commented how precious a gift Ruqayya was to her parents and how grateful they were that Allah had blessed this family with a healthy child. It was not until the baby began to squirm and whimper that Timiro reminded the guests it was time for feeding. Timiro took Ruqayya inside the house to nurse. When she came back outside, the feast was underway. Platters of rice, meat, and vegetables flowed to the guests in different parts of the house. Pots of steaming tea that followed the meal continued well into the evening. People ate and congratulated Timira and her husband. Only 2 days after the big celebration, Timira's father, Farah, his stepmother, and the twins prepared to leave. I am sorry to see you go, Timira said. Not as sorry as we are not to be with you, her father said. May Allah be with you. Fatima pulled Timira close to her. Timira repeated after her, tightening her arms around her father, Farah, the twins, and Fatima in turn. They remained wrapped in each other's arms until Muhammad cleared his throat. We have to go so you don't miss the bus. Their hug lingered for another minute before they followed Muhammad toward the door. Timiro stood before the house and waved until they disappeared into the alley, leading them toward the market's bus depot. Only 9 months after the birth of her daughter, Timiro was pregnant for the 5th time. This was unexpected because it was much earlier than the 2 years in which culturally mothers breastfed their babies. I didn't even know it was possible, Timira said to Dahabo, to get pregnant while still nursing a baby. You must be ready to give this one a brother or a sister. Dahabo rocked Ruqayya on her lap. Ever since the birth, Dahabo visited Timiro the evenings Muhammad worked. The idea was to keep Timiro company, but they both knew Dahabo loved spending time with the baby. All her children were grown and away. Timiro knew Ruqayya was the closest thing Dahabo had to a grandchild. There was no reason to speak to it. Timiro appreciated the support as much as Dahabo enjoyed being with them. I don't know what to do. Should I stop breastfeeding? Continue as long as you can. Breastfeed one while pregnant with another? Yes, Dahabo said. Your body will tell you when it's enough. That made no sense to Timiro, but she took Dahaba's advice because she trusted her so much. So Timiro continued to nurse her daughter. Weeks rolled by, and her body didn't notice it being double-timed. Her daughter thrived on the milk from her breasts, but Timiro worried about the baby inside, the one she had no access to. Maybe it's starving inside. If Dahabo, the other woman in the group, or her husband shared her fear, they didn't acknowledge it. So 18 weeks into her term, Timiro stopped without getting the notice Dahabo spoke about. The worry that accompanied her for the rest of the 9 months evaporated as soon as her son was born. Abdul Qadir came out ready to conquer the world. Timiro expected her husband's happiness to surpass the one he displayed after Ruqayya was born. But that didn't happen. He was happy, to be sure. He celebrated the birth of his son with as much lavishness as when his daughter arrived. Timiro expected Muhammad to have a bigger celebration for his son's coming out ceremony, but nothing eclipsed her husband's joy to be Ruqayya's father. Like her name suggested, his daughter held the center of his universe. The sun rose over the small town of Luq as Timiro woke up. She took a deep breath and stretched, feeling grateful for another day. It's been 4 years since her marriage to Muhammad. Chasing after 2 small children made the days. Weeks and months move in a blur. But she found the rhythm in the pace of her day and was grateful for every moment. Like every other morning since she had her daughter, Timiro left her bed after the morning prayer and went to the cot where her children slept. She paid close attention to her steps, ensuring her slippers made no sound against the tiles. It would be another hour before they would stir for the day, where they would demand her attention simultaneously. She'd often struggled with the guilt of giving one more than the other, but during those moments while they slept, she could observe them equally. She stood right in the middle of the 2 cots with one hand on each. She planted her feet precisely the distance between the 2 as if she'd used measuring tape to establish her equal love for both. "Good morning," her husband said a few minutes later. "How beautiful they are." "Yes, they are," she said, smiling. Timiro and her husband did this every morning. She'd go in first and he would join her. After the morning greetings, no other words would pass between them. Timiro liked it that way. This was the best time of her day, and she suspected the same was true for her husband. The silence was part of soaking in the presence of 2 healthy children. She'd inhale deeply to take in the peace that sleeping vases exuded and escape from the exhaustion of running after 2 small children with their never-ending supply of energy. But this morning felt different. Her husband seemed as if he was going to say something. Timiro turned to him for a quick second to stop him from saying anything. "Please don't spoil the moment," she tried to speak with her eyes. Timiro returned her gaze to the children, their eyes closed and mouths open slightly. Her son and daughter lay there like angels, resting after the long flight they took to bless her and her husband with so much joy. At the sight of the 2 tucked under the small blankets she'd knitted for them, Timiro quietly uttered thanksgiving prayer for the chance to be a mother again. It was only by the grace of Allah that she was afforded such an opportunity. This was a better end to a bitter beginning. She didn't remember how long she was standing there when she noticed her husband hadn't left to get into his uniform. Perhaps he needed more of that quietness before going to the station. "I'll go to the kitchen to start breakfast," she said. She stepped away from him and he followed. "I have something to tell you." He faced her with tense eyes. Timiro turned to him so fast she almost lost her footing. His tone and words frightened her. She was the happiest she'd been since her mother's departure, and she didn't want to lose newfound of joy she'd gained over the past few years. "Is something the matter?" "It depends." Muhammad's response only ignited her fear. "On what?" If this was a terrible news, she wanted to hear it at once. Timiro couldn't stand his measured response, like prey watching her predator approach. Her breathing became shallow, and thick beads of sweat covered her forehead. "Tell me," she spoke deliberately to steady her shaking voice. "The military is transferring me to Beitabo." Her husband moved closer to her and rested his hand on her shoulder. She shrugged him off and tried to move away from him. His words had shattered her peaceful morning. She wanted to pretend she didn't hear him speak. "We have to move soon." "We?" Timira didn't know what she'd expected her husband to say, but the news rattled her. Move to Beit Abo? She was not only leaving a city she'd come to love with great friends and good community, but she had to return to that awful city. Could she even exist in a place that had taken her brother and mother from her, the town that had destroyed her family? Her legs shook, and she only had a few seconds to reach for one of the stools in the kitchen before her knees buckled beneath her. "You see," Mohammed began apologetically, "I have to go where they sent me." Timur knew that, but knowing it did nothing to reduce the waves of fury that engulfed her. But who was she angry at? Was it her mother who decided to leave her, or those who had taken her brother? Maybe her rage was against the military now. Did they need to send her back to the hell that was Beit Abo? "I have no control over when and where I am transferred," Mohammed said. Timira could see the concern on her husband's face and knew it wasn't his fault. "We'll move then." She prepared herself for the inevitable as she saw her husband off to work, aware that her happiness had come to an end. My Mother, the Person and the Patient can be found in Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please remember to follow, like, and share, and join me next week as I share with you another episode of my mother's journey as both the person and the patient. Thank you.